Ave Maria, and welcome to Divine Poetry, a series that explores the chronological parallels between the history of the Catholic Church and the Old Testament. If you're new to this concept, go back and watch my interview with Kevin Davis. The link is in the video description below. To make things more simple, I have divided up church history and the Old Testament into 8 color-coded time periods. Below you can see a scrolling bar with the names, dates, and the Old Testament books for each period. Use this timeline to guide you in each video. The color frame of each video will match the time period that we're discussing. Now, let's start today's episode. Hello, and welcome to Episode 9 of Divine Poetry. Today, I want to break the mold again and talk about a set of parallels that aren't really included in the concept that my book is based on, which is the idea that all of church history is prefigured by the Old Testament in chronological order. So today I want to focus on what I call a micro-parallel or a smaller frame of reference. And it's I note this in my book on page 11, Roman numeral 11 in the preface. I say that there also exists minor or micro-parallels between the Old Testament and smaller, more regional people and events in church history. These micro-parallels, as I call them, can be perceived by shrinking down the frame of reference and viewing the Old Testament story inside a limited framework of church history. For example, and that what I'm going to cover today, is the history of Ireland, and it also parallels the Old Testament in chronological order, all by itself and without reference to the wider context of history. So these parallels of what I'm going to present today is just the history of Ireland only. So if you just look at Ireland by itself and the Irish people, and don't look at don't look at the rest of the history of the church, you'll also see that the history of Israel maps out onto the history of Ireland all by itself in like a micro version of these parallels. It's fantastic. It's really hard to wrap my own head around it, let alone try to explain it. But I will show you what I have loosely put together as parallels between the history of Ireland and the history of Israel in the Old Testament. Now, I also want to just mention that the same time periods that apply to the greater context of church history also apply here. So, when you look for let's just pick an example, the Babylonian captivity period in church history roughly maps out to like the French Revolution and afterwards. In Irish history, it's about that same time period. It's late 1700s and the 1800s. So more or less, the time periods are matching. There's some instances where they kind of go forward and go backwards. It's still a poem. It's not exact science or a mechanized system. It's still poetry, I like to say. But roughly speaking, the time periods map out. Great. 2 things before I start. I want to say hi to my Irish friend, Andy. Cheers, mate. I'm thinking of you today, and I pray for you every day. And also, I want to say just about my book. So my book was released on Easter Monday, and I was very, very happy with the demand. I thank you, everybody, for supporting me. Whoever got a book, I really appreciate your support and interest. If you do still want to get a book, you can find it on the website. You can see right below. If you do order from me, I include a 9x16 color 2-sided brochure that maps out in graphical format the parallels of the histories between the two, old and new. But if you live outside of the continental U.S., I'm afraid you have to get it from Amazon because international shipping is just so expensive. Okay, so with all that, let's get started here. Let's start with Moses. So I know Moses is not exactly the start of the Old Testament, but he's pretty close. And so Moses, he frees his people from bondage, obviously, and he brings them out of Israel into the wilderness, into the promised land. Well, no, he doesn't actually make it to the promised land. But consider St. Patrick and Moses. Consider the parallels between them. So both went back to their people to save them. St. Patrick, he was taken as a slave into Ireland, and he went back to Britain, and he considered the Irish his own, and he went back to save them, just like Moses did. They were both shepherds in exile. If you remember, Moses was exiled to Midian, and there he became a shepherd, and there he was called by God to return to Egypt and free his people from their bondage. St. Patrick, the same thing. He was also a shepherd in his slavery, in his exile in Ireland. Okay, so they both received their calling from God when they were away. St. Patrick was away again from Ireland, and God called him back to go save them, and same thing with Moses. And see here, There's a lot of little things. And there's a lot of the stories of St. Patrick that I personally don't know. But I suspect there's a lot more between St. Patrick and Moses that I'm going to be able to present in this quick video. So they both climbed a mountain and fasted for 40 days. Or they both climbed a mountain for 40 days. Moses, of course, was Mount Sinai, and St. Patrick climbed Patrick, which is the mountain in western Ireland, right by the city of Westport, where St. Patrick is said to have fasted for 40 days. So amazing. They both turned the water to blood. Moses turned the Nile River to blood, and there's a lake in Ireland called Loch Derg, which means, I think, Red Lake. And the legend or story is that St. Patrick killed a giant snake, and the water turned red to blood, hence the name Red Lake or Loch Derg. We have both had a staff. Moses' staff he would strike the rock with, or he would separate the Red Sea with, just like how St. Patrick's staff, he used that. God used St. Patrick and his staff to work many miracles as well. I'll try to put some examples on the screen. They both saved the people from the snakes. If you remember the story, of course you do, of Moses when the snakes were striking and killing the Israelites in the desert, and God commanded Moses to mount a bronze serpent on a pole. And in so doing, people were saved from the snakes. And of course, St. Patrick drove the snakes out of Ireland. Let's see, we have both of them freed their people from the paganism and slavery. I already covered that. And both are considered like the ultimate prophet or father figure. When you read the Old Testament and even into the New Testament, they're always talking about Moses. Moses was, the central lawgiver, the central prophet, the greatest prophet. And who can doubt that St. Patrick is the towering father figure for the Irish? Okay, I probably did too much there, but let's move on to the Exodus story. So then the Israelites go out into bondage. Oh, by the way, St. Patrick lived in the mid-400s, which is important. I'll try to keep these dates straight. So now we have St. Brendan in the late 400s, early 500s, and he was known for his remarkable navigatio, where he wandered the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, for 7 years, looking for, amazingly, what's it called here? I have it written down. Yes, the land of promise of the saints. So he's looking for the land of promise, or the promised land. And so we have, of course, the Israelites wandering for 40 years looking for the promised land. The Sinai Desert is akin to the Atlantic Ocean, very broad, dangerous, empty wildernesses. Let's see here. I'm going to go through these quickly. I probably have a lot to cover, and I'm probably already over my time. Okay, well, this is amazing. So St. Brendan, when on his voyage, when he was close to the Americas, they found giant grapes, and they were sustained on those grapes for a number of days. But how notable that the Israelites also carried that huge bunch of giant grapes out of the promised land. Very, very poignant similarities, of course. What else do we have? Both were given miraculous food on their journey, the manna from heaven, and different points in St. Brendan's journey, birds would bring him food, or he would find miraculous giant grapes or things like that. All right, and they both wandered in circles for a time. St. Brendan would go back and forth from different islands until finally God said, okay, I'll bring you now to the promised land of the saints, or the land promised to the saints. And similarly, the Israelites wandered for 40 years, not in a straight line, but kind of zigzagging a little bit until they finally got to the promised land 40 years later. All right, enough of that. Now we have the next major period in Irish history is when the Vikings started to show up. And I think I just researched it, but I forgot. I'm going to say it's in the 700s when the Vikings started showing up. And they started to wreak havoc on the Irish, who were relatively defenseless against them. This is just like the enemy tribes in the time of the Judges, and also like the Philistines. They were a major thorn in the side of the Irish. The O'Neill clan, which was the northern clan of Ireland, they were the first real defenders of the Irish people. They tried to exert their influence over all of the island, but they couldn't. They got most of it, just like how King Saul did the same thing. And they both would try to defend and protect the Irish, and by comparison, the Israelites. The second king protector, of course, is King David in the Old Testament, and that is Brian Boru. He was the first one to unite all of Ireland under him. Didn't last very long, but he did. And King David did the same thing. David, through his wars, drove off the enemies of Israel. And it's been said many times that Brian Boru at the Battle of Clontarf ended the Viking raids into Ireland. What followed afterwards in the Old Testament were the time of the kings. So all of David's descendants, they ruled as kings up until the Babylonian captivity period. And that's a lot like it was called the Lordship of Ireland period, which is from 1169 to the 1500s, when the lords of Ireland ruled as clans. They had different clans. There was in Munster, I forget I'm gonna butcher the pronunciation, so I'm not even gonna try. But anyway, these clans are akin to the 12 tribes of Israel. They were geographical clans. They were family related, and they each had like a head that they honored from a descendant from the past who spawned that clan, just like the 12 sons of Israel spawned the Israelite tribes. Okay, going fast here. Excuse me. Right. So then later on comes the north-south split in Israel. So you have Jeroboam separates the north and the south, and the north go into apostasy. And lo and behold, what do we have in Irish history? We have a north-south split as well, with the north going into apostasy. It's the Protestant north. So the Assyrians in the Old Testament, they come and resettle some of their people into the land, specifically in the north is where it happens. And the upper class and the leading elites are often resettled out of the north of Israel. So this is the Assyrian policy of a forced relocation as a way to kind of like dominate and to weaken the will of the people by settling foreigners in the land. And that's exactly what happened in Ireland. So after Henry VIII comes along in the mid-1500s, and they start to resettle Protestants in Ireland, and it really took hold in the north. So in 1607, you have the famous Flight of the Earls, when all of the Irish nobility in the north fled. And the English sowed the land with new settlers, the Protestant English settlers. And so now you have the same thing happening in Israel with the north as well. That's where the Samaritans came from. That's why the Jews and the Samaritans had such an animosity, because the Samaritans were somewhat Israeli-like. They had semblances and some kind of perversions of the Israelite law and religion, just like how the Northerners have the same thing in Ireland. They're Protestants, but they're kind of Irish too. And there's been undeniably animosity throughout history between the north and south of Ireland. Okay, what am I hitting here? So Henry VIII is a lot like Nabucodonosor, or the Assyrians, but also Nabucodonosor, but who really parallels Nabucodonosor a lot, which is the Babylonian captivity, by the way, is Cromwell. So Cromwell, he's the one who destroyed the Rock of Cashel in 1647, just like how the Babylonians and Nabucodonosor destroyed the temple in the Old Testament. So then, following the British complete annexing control of Ireland, especially in the 1800s. Now I'm moving quickly, I know. In the 1800s, they were evicting Irish from their homes during the famine, so they were confiscating all of the land of the Irish, and the Irish now are exiles, and they're living as beggars and poor in their own land, just like how the Jews were actually taken out of their own land and brought into exile in Babylon. But in both cases, they're brought into a foreign land with foreign laws. They don't have their land anymore. And also, in the Old Testament, that time of the Babylonian captivity was known as the Jewish diaspora. That's when the Jews were really brought out of their land and spread out. They were kind of spread out all over the Babylonian Empire. Some of them left for Egypt. And so in Irish history, of course, during the potato famine, we have the Irish quote-unquote diaspora. That's the time of Irish immigration. That's when they all fled Ireland, millions and millions of them. So many coming to America, Australia, even parts of the United Kingdom. Fascinating. Okay, so after then some time in exile, in the Old Testament, King Cyrus lets the Jews go back and hold Jerusalem as a city-state, effectively letting them going back to their own land and ruling it again. And then in the 1920s, into the early 1920s, actually starting in the late 1800s, but into the 1920s, we have the Home Rule movement in Ireland, where the Irish want to rule over their land again. So it's amazingly similar to King Cyrus. And just like how the Samaritans were opposing the Jews when they were going back under the decree of Cyrus to rule over Jerusalem again. Remember, the Samaritans were trying to stop them. They opposed them. They were petitioning the king to not let this happen. That's exactly what the Ulster Protestants were doing. They didn't want the home rule of the Irish. They didn't want them to have rule over the land. They wanted them to be subject to the king, just like how they were before. So, amazingly, the parallels. All right, the republics formed in 1948, 1949 in Ireland, and again, that's much like the rebuilding of the wall, so to speak, of Jerusalem. Now, Now, the books of the Maccabees now come next, and that's the start of a really bad persecution of the Jews by the Greeks. That's in church history, in the broader parallels that I was demonstrating before, not the Irish ones, but that maps out into the 50s, 60s, and 70s with the Second Vatican Council, and I've really talked about that extensively. But amazingly, during the 60s and 70s in Ireland, you have the Troubles, and the Troubles seem a lot to me. I haven't got into too much of the details because I'm kind of rushed in making this video, but just generally speaking, the Troubles really map out onto the Maccabees a lot. There's like guerrilla warfare, there's a fighting back, there's a lot of violence and little horrible stories that are happening. And even the name, the Troubles, really kind of gives a good Irish sense to like what was happening to the Jews in the times of the Maccabees. Okay, and then finally, we have, brings us up to our current day in Ireland, we have the European Union. Up until like just up in 2016, the EU ruled both Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland because the Republic of Ireland, they joined the EU, I think back in the 90s, probably, I think it was, if not the early 2000s. And the United Kingdom, which was ruling over Northern Ireland, also joined the EU. Now, of course, the United Kingdom left the EU just recently with the Brexit, but for a long time the EU ruled over the whole island of Ireland, just like how the Romans came in and swept up all of the region of around Judea, Jerusalem, and even into Egypt. The Romans took everything, just like the EU did. And what's so significant about Rome taking over Jerusalem in that is that they're famous for building their roads. The famous Roman roads made much easier for travel in the Roman Empire, but the EU, one of the first things the EU did is it built roads in Ireland. It built interstate roads, which is fascinating because that's what Romans do. Romans build roads. I'm missing a whole lot of details here, and I do apologize for that. I just wanted to share with you. I think by now, if you have seen the parallels between church history and the Old Testament in the larger context, then I think I was ready to present a subset of those parallels, which are these micro-parallels, because I think you're potentially more ready to see, something as abstract as Irish history by itself, prefiguring the Old Testament. Admittedly, I have not done a lot of research into this. I picked this up a couple of years ago, and I just today put together some more notes. So there's a lot of work to be done here. I mean, I think it's very clear, just at a very cursory bird's eye view analysis of Irish history, that it does parallel the Old Testament in the same way, which is beautiful. Anyway, I hope this makes sense, and I hope I wasn't discrediting myself. Have a blessed Easter, Ave Maria, and I'll see you next week.